Hey, good morning, everyone. Good to see you. I'm not sure what to say. We're living in this wonderland these days, and let's just say there's a lot going on, and very little of it is, I think, productive and effective. So I want to thank you for joining us here today at the Boston Foundation, and those of you, I think, online for this important report release and discussion about boys and men in Greater Boston, challenges in education, employment, and health. And because you are a part of this event, I'm sure you will agree with me when I say how nice it is to participate in an event which celebrates and validates the importance of research and data in our society, no matter what others may say, as a tool to help us understand the world around us, and of course as a tool to help us develop more effective and data-driven solutions that improve lives and strengthen communities. At the Boston Foundation, our role as a civic leader and convener is something we are very proud of, a role that is fueled in large part by the work of the Boston Indicators, you will hear from later, our incredibly talented research organization. Through their entrepreneurial research, we, along with leaders from all sectors across our community, leaders invested in the greater good, are able to track and follow emerging issues in our communities and our region. Let me get this out of the way. Some of you here today may be wondering why, or even maybe feeling, as I do, a little uncomfortable that we are focused on a report solely on boys and men. And I think that is a very good thing. I believe and I hope that you do too in the importance of civic dialogue and debate and engaging with new ideas like what you will hear today. Here's a little bit more about why we embarked on this journey. Over the years, TBF and the Boston Indicators have increasingly focused on racial injustice and disparities. And as we dug into the data around racial injustice and disparities more deeply, it became clear that when you simply look at race without also taking into account income, class, education, or country of origin, you miss key stories and key dynamics. Put another way, you miss the opportunity to dig into key stories and key dynamics. And this research is being released today shows that we need to do a better job, or an improved job, looking at race, income, education, and gender more closely. At TBF, our commitment to gender and specific identity groups has long been a part of how we sought to engage and serve the community, especially communities that are historically marginalized. We realize that while many aspects of identity, race, gender, sexual orientation, age, and so much more are intersectional, there's also a real value in understanding the distinctive needs and opportunities for different groups. I should say distinct opportunities and challenges for groups. I want to remind us that identifying and acknowledging and addressing the issues specifically facing boys and men is not a zero-sum game. And by doing so, it will not detract from efforts to tackle issues that are still facing girls and women. We can do more for boys and men without doing less for girls and women. And as someone who spent most of my career in higher education, much of which you will hear about today in terms of men's declining attendance and graduation rates in colleges and universities, not much of this really surprised me. that trend has becoming more apparent to me each year as I spent as a college and a university president. And I'm excited to deepen my understanding and knowledge about that issue today, among many other issues facing boys and men. Before I leave the podium, I want to thank the members of the Boston Indicators team, Luke Schuster, Kelly Harrington, and DJ Windsor from the American Institute for Boys and Men for their excellent work and collaboration on this really very important project. And I also want to thank Boston's very own Daryl C. Murphy, the host of The Common on BUR. Where are you, by the way? Oh, there you are. Good to see you. Glad to have you here. Thank you for being with us today to interview the brilliant Richard Reeves, whom you will meet later. He is brilliant and well-dressed. He's the, well, you know, well, that's a high standard. Author of Boys and Men and founder and president of the American Institute for Boys and Men. So thank you all once again for being here, and now it's my pleasure to turn this over to our research team, Luke, Kelly, and DJ.
Thanks a lot, Lee. Folks hear me okay? Great. Yeah, really appreciate folks turning out in person and everybody watching online. One of the really nice things about having our research center here at the Boston Foundation is the encouragement from folks like Lee to be entrepreneurial, tracking new ideas, new issues as they emerge, and I think this report's a great example of doing that. A few of us on the Indicators team read Of Boys and Men, Richard's book, a couple of years ago, and after reading it, it was one of those books that just sticks in your mind and you start noticing the issues sprouting up in a bunch of ways that you hadn't quite appreciated before. For me, on a personal level, I'm the dad of 7-year-old twin boys who are in their 4th year of public schools in Somerville. They're in separate strands, and neither of them has had a single male teacher so far in their K-12 experience. And among all the specialists they've had, they've only had one male teacher. Anybody want to guess what subject that male specialist teaches? Gym, yeah. Now, you know, I noticed that before reading Richard's book, but I just didn't think much of it, knowing that teaching was a female-dominated occupation. But what we have since learned is that the skew has gotten worse in recent decades, not better. We've also been noticing some interesting research nuggets from others in Greater Boston who are highlighting these challenges. Mass Inc. did a great report a couple years ago on teacher representation, focused mostly on racial disparities in the teaching force in Massachusetts, but some of the tables also broke out by race and, also by gender, and you could see the very low numbers of especially male teachers of color in Massachusetts schools. In Boston, they formed a new Office of Black Male Advancement. Thanks to some of you folks for coming out and supporting the work, doing a wide range of initiatives to support young Black men in particular. The Boston Foundation partners on the education team have worked for years with researchers like those at the Boston PIC to analyze the issues in higher ed that Lee was mentioning, and they've done work that's disaggregated by gender and showed some of these emerging issues, but no one had pulled it all together in one report. So this research is an effort to do that for the first time. As you'll see in the research presentation, it's wide-ranging, looking at education, health, mental health, and broader issues in the economy. A big shout out to folks who served on the advisory committee to support this work. You'll have a chance to get a hard copy of the report when you leave, and there's a listing of all the people who contributed to the work on the advisory committee and the actual report. Let me add to something Lee said in his opening comments. We got this question a bunch while working on the report. Really, you're doing a report just on boys and men when there are so many challenges that remain for women and girls? One other response I'd like to add to what Lee said is there's a really important pragmatic reason that we ought to engage in these issues. Men are half the population, and by not engaging in these debates, we have left a void for more reactionary voices to come in, and too often their response is to notice the challenges facing boys and men and to push for a return to a bygone era of rigid gender roles. And I think that's a vision that's, neither possible, frankly, but certainly not desirable. And what's needed is more proactive engagement from progressive, forward-looking voices to articulate what would a positive vision of masculinity look like in modern America. And without doing that in a proactive way, we are ceding ground to those reactionary voices. And I'll say something I have so appreciated about the partnership with AIBM is how they model engaging in those conversations thoughtfully. They are a nonpartisan organization, but deeply rooted in liberal values of debate, discourse, dialogue with people of different vantage points. And I think that's something, frankly, we struggle with sometimes in a very blue city like Boston. Interestingly, Richard, in the last month, has done interviews about this work, both on The Daily Show and on Theo Vaughn's popular podcast this past weekend. I'm willing to bet that there are very few regular This Past Weekend listeners in the room today. I had hardly heard of it before. I just checked Spotify's top podcast charts, and it's one of the very most popular podcasts in the entire country. It's a very male-skewed audience, and if we're ever going to get over the ideological divides that feel like they're hardening around us, it's going to have to be doing that sort of work to engage with people who view the world a bit differently than us. Let me add just one final note, which is we know this research is being released at a moment of increased attack on people in marginalized communities, especially against people who are transgender or gender non-binary. And there is a way in which our report really does assume a gender binary by focusing on comparisons between males and females. One of the reasons we do that is because we rely on public data sets that have traditionally only collected information in that way. There actually had been some really important efforts to gather better information on sexual orientation and gender identity in recent years, and a couple of the surveys in the report that we reference actually do have information for transgender youth in particular. Unfortunately, those efforts have not only been halted, but really directly reversed at the federal level in the last few weeks. And I just want to say, from the Boston Indicator's perspective, we are very committed to being part of efforts to resist those changes to advances that have been happening in data collection and do research around challenges facing other groups in addition to boys and men. So with that, let's get into the research presentation. I'll pass it in just a second to my colleague, Kelly Harrington, who will present the physical health and mental health sections. From there, she'll pass it to DJ, who will present the education and employment and wages section. Thanks a lot, Kelly.
Okay, thank you so much, Luke. Let me adjust this. Oop. Okay, so whoops, it's a little loose there. So I want to start by thanking the research partners that worked with me in the trenches on this project that aren't going to come up today, and that's Ravon Harami, Alana Williams, and Lucas Munson, and I'm not sure where he is, but he's here somewhere. And I'm going to talk today about physical health, including life expectancy and the leading causes of death among men, and then I'll talk about mental health concerns for men. So first, let's talk about life expectancy. So it's kind of common knowledge that men live shorter lives than women, but we don't often pause to think about what a kind of sobering fact of life that really is and what might be behind it. So in order to try to understand that, we dug into kind of the leading causes of death. And it's absolutely true. Men in Massachusetts can expect to live to the age of 83, and women can expect to live to the age of 78. And let's see, and that's a 5-year age gap, and that's really a significant finding, but the magnitude of that gender gap really doesn't present until you look at the data by race, income, and education, which is exactly what we did. Let's see. So pretty much we see that Black and Latino men have a much shorter lifespan than the rest of the racial groups here, and the gender gap is much wider. So the gender gap is 8 years for Latino men and 7 years for Black men. And just to really drive this point home, on the next slide here, we took this from the Brookings Papers on Economic Activity, and it shows how really regardless of gender, this is for both men and women, the life expectancy really varies by education. And so among men and women who have a BA, they far outlive men and women without a BA. And so this is really a cross-cutting theme. These types of disparities are really a cross-cutting theme in the national research of AIBM and also in the local analysis that we did for this project. And it's really that, for these challenges facing boys and men, it's really Latino, Black, lower income, and non-college educated men who are the most affected. And then for issues where men are really thriving, that's really concentrated among the most advantaged. So going back to health outcomes, to try to understand the conditions leading to men's earlier deaths, we dug into the leading causes of death for men in Massachusetts. And in Massachusetts in 2022, that was cancer, suicide, heart disease, and accidental injuries. So we'll start by looking at chronic diseases, including cancer, cardiovascular disease, and diabetes. So here we see that men really do die of these diseases at much higher rates than women. So for example, we see that men die of cardiovascular disease at more than 1.5 times the rate of women. And if we look at this by race, we see that the gender gaps really vary depending on the conditions that you're looking at. And what might be behind these gender gaps could be higher consumption of tobacco and alcohol, differences in the way that men manage stress, lower insurance rates, lower rates of going to the doctor, and when men do go to the doctor, lower adherence to medical advice. And then on top of that, at the national and state level, their public health departments really don't put a lot of attention to men's health, and there really aren't a lot of official goals and programs that focus on men's health. And that really leaves a lot of room for improvement. So another leading cause of death among men is accidental injury deaths. And the fact that accidental injury deaths are so much higher for men in Massachusetts could be related to higher risk-seeking behavior, but it's really driven in large part by drug overdoses. And so we see that more than half of accidental injury deaths in Massachusetts are due to poisoning deaths, which includes opioid overdose deaths. And so on the next slide, we'll see that men have really consistently made up the majority of opioid overdose deaths in Massachusetts, and that their share of deaths has been growing over the years, especially since 2010. And the good news is that opioid overdose deaths among men has declined a bit, so between 2022 and 2023. But in 2023, men still did make up 72% of all opioid overdose deaths, which is still a really significant share. And the majority of that decline in deaths between 2022 and 2023 was among white men. So we see here the trend line for white men declining in the past few years, but the trend line for Latinos remaining elevated, and the trend line for Black men continuing to climb. And so because the opioid crisis really started out as an issue heavily affecting white men, they have benefited from targeted treatment services over the years. And so now the trends have really reversed, and Black men are falling behind, Black and Latino men are falling behind. So it's really important that we focus on targeted treatment programs, now focusing on Black and Latino men. So now let's talk about mental health. So mental health for men is often overlooked. And I hate to say it, but we have this has played out in the work at Boston Indicators as well in the past couple of years. So 2 years ago, we released a research brief about youth mental health, and we pointed to data showing that high school girls report higher levels of sadness, suicidal ideation, and suicide attempt. And this is absolutely true, but boys die of suicide at much higher rates than girls. And this is true for adult men as well. So essentially, it's that if you look at just suicidal ideation and attempt, the story looks one way, but it looks another way if you look at suicide deaths. So here we see that men have consistently made up the majority of suicide deaths, and that's declined a bit since 2018, but the gender gap has really widened since 2000, and now men make up more than 3/4 of suicide deaths in Massachusetts. And I do want to note here that this is an area where we do not have suicide death data for transgender and non-binary folks. And I note that here specifically because we do have data showing that transgender and non-binary youth report much higher rates of suicide ideation and attempt. So that lack of data really leaves a significant knowledge gap that we need to be able to fill in order to adequately support these youth. But going back to the data that we do have, we also know that suicide varies by race or by age. So here we see that that men over the age of 85 die of suicide at by far the highest rates. And suicide among women above the age 85 is so uncommon that the Massachusetts Death Report actually isn't able to even report that rate because the number is so small, which is why you see the asterisk here on the right-hand side. And so one of the reasons that older men may die of suicide at higher rates could be because men's connections tend to wither over time, and men just in general have fewer friends and tend to be less likely to make new friends and ask for help, which can lead to loneliness and isolation. And we also looked at measures of social isolation and connection among youth. So we looked at high schoolers in Massachusetts, and the story there seems much more kind of mixed. It doesn't seem like it's just a boy issue. It unfortunately seems like it's an issue affecting kind of youth across genders. So what connects all of the topics that I just talked about? It does seem that there are some kinds of social norms at play here that really keep men from seeking help, from making new friends, from going to the doctor, that type of thing. And we didn't dig into those social norms too much for this report, but AIBM has done some really thoughtful thinking and writing on the intersection of structural issues and cultural norms. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from Richard on those later. So with that, I am going to pass it over to DJ.
Everyone hear me okay? Awesome. All right, so when we talk about education gaps by gender, it's really important that we bring in the historical context. So through much of the 20th century, girls and women faced significant barriers in education, whether that was limited access to advanced course placement, access to higher education, or just bias, especially in fields like math and science. And once many of those barriers were lifted, most notably Title IX in the late 70s, we've seen a drastic rise in girls' and women's educational attainment and academic performance, which is fantastic. We've actually done such a good job that the gender gap in bachelor degrees is wider today than it was when Title IX was first passed. Now it's just reversed with men on the shorter end. And we believe that should garner a similar level of attention and efforts to help understand why that's happening and improving outcomes for boys and men without impeding on the progress we've made for girls and women. And to bring in some context about Greater Boston, so the schools in this area and the state overall rank among the highest nationally. So boys are actually doing quite well in school, and just as girls are as well. However, we still do see gender gaps that favor girls, just like much of the country. And when we look into the percentage of students at or above proficiency level for reading and math, we see that boys are slightly behind in 4th grade. in terms of reading. And in 8th grade, that gap persists. And on the other hand, for math, boys are actually quite a bit ahead, and that gap continues in 8th grade, but that gap does narrow. Moving into high school, looking at more of these broader academic performance indicators, girls are ahead in 9th grade course passing, advanced course completion, 4-year graduation rate, and these gaps range from about 4 to 6%. And these gaps may not seem that big when we look at this, and that one of the reasons is boys are doing actually quite well in Greater Boston. However, once we disaggregate by income and disaggregate by race, these gender gaps start to widen. So bringing income into the equation now, what we're looking at here is the graduation rate gap between girls and boys, and how much that favors girls. And we're looking at this by median household income of the school district. So first, here we see Boston School District. They have about a $90,000 median household income, and boys are about 10 percentage points behind girls in graduation rate. And once we bring in the rest of the school districts in the state, we begin to see a trend. So as income decreases, we see that boys are falling farther and farther behind girls. And then looking into college, I already mentioned the gap in college degrees earned. Women, there's about a 13 percentage points ahead. And then when we break this down by race, there actually is an exception. Asian men are more likely than Asian women to have a bachelor's degrees, even though both of them do rank relatively high in Greater Boston. We revert back to the trend looking at other racial groups. So 9 percentage point gap favoring women when looking at white. For Hispanic, a 2 percentage point gap. And here we begin to see a stark racial disparity. And then the largest gender gap is between black men and black women, a 20 percentage point gap. And this is signaling that there are still structural barriers by race impacting black men, but not only that, we're seeing barriers at the intersection of both race and gender. Just like a quick summary. I mean, these education gaps really do have serious consequences. One, first, limiting many men's access to good jobs, especially jobs that are high growth right now, increasingly requiring college degrees. And that has ripple effects into lifetime earnings, and as Kelly mentioned, health outcomes. Now looking into employment and wages, and before diving into this, I think it's important to talk about how the economy has shifted in Greater Boston and what that has meant for men and women. So over the past several decades, just like much of the country, we've seen a shift away from blue-collar jobs like manufacturing and trade. And these blue-collar jobs used to offer, especially men, more stable employment. And not only that, a strong sense of security, identity, role, and status within family, within society. And at the same time, we've seen high growth fields such as education, healthcare, professional services, increasingly requiring college degrees. And in the case of education and healthcare, those jobs have been dominated and more likely to be held by women. And this shift has had ripple effects, not only in men's employment rates and wages, but also their sense of identity, where they feel they fit in the world, and their overall health and well-being. So diving into the data now, so here we have employment rates. So we've seen remarkable progress amongst women since the 80s, going from 65% employment rate to 80%, and now the gap has closed to just about 5% now. But however, we do see a steady decline among men in employment rate. And when we break this down by education, even men with bachelor degrees have seen a slight decline in employment rate. However, the starkest decline has been among men without a bachelor degrees, going from about 87% in the 80s to today around 78%. And we've seen a similar a similar trend in wages. So it is still important to note that there's still this gender gap in wages where men are still making a quite bit more than women. However, men and women with bachelor degrees have seen steady wage growth over the past 4 decades. However, men and women without bachelor degrees have seen quite stagnant growth. And breaking this down by race, Black men and Latino men have seen the slowest wage growth since the 80s, with white and Asian men making about 1.5 to 2 times more. So we've seen that there's been a decline in employment rate among men, but it's not only important to understand, who is out of the workforce and how many, but why are they out of the workforce? So for women, they're actually more likely to report that caretaking is the reason that they're out of the workforce, about half of women reporting that. On the other hand, men are more likely to report health concerns, about half reporting that illness or disability is taking them out of the workforce. And this has very important implications. So for women, this is still highlighting the tension between paid work, caregiving responsibilities at home, and paid work and career advancement. And for men, this is pointing to potential gaps in healthcare access, job accommodation, and maybe the need for stronger support for re-entry into the workforce after chronic illness or disability. And lastly, I want to talk about how the industries have shifted and what that has meant for men and women. Apologies for the small chart, but if you can squint a little bit. So these first four industries we see here are the industries in Greater Boston that have seen job declines over the past decade. So we have manufacturing, wholesale trade, other services, and retail trade. Manufacturing and wholesale trade seeing the largest declines, and these happen to be male-dominated industries, and you see that nearly all the job loss is coming from men. And these next 4 industries are the 4 industries that have the highest job growth over the past decade: healthcare, education, construction, and professional, scientific, and technical services. So one thing that really stands out is construction. That has seen a ton of growth over the past decade. Male-dominated industry, many of the jobs don't require a college education. So this could possibly be a good path for many men. On the other hand, we see that healthcare and education are typically female-dominated industries. Most of the growth is coming from women. And why is this important? One, these are growing fields. They're becoming more stable employment paths that many men are not able to take advantage of, because if they're not earning bachelor degrees at the same rate or not entering these fields to study them, they're not taking up these jobs. And also tying it all together with health, if we want to improve health outcomes for men, we believe it's important that men are represented in healthcare, such as social work, psychotherapy, and things like that. And then education, same thing. If we want to improve the health education outcomes for our boys and men, boys should feel represented with more male teachers in the field. And that wraps up our research presentation, and I'm going to pass it off to Richard and Daryl for some chats and Q&A.
Hello, hello. Good morning.
Good morning.
All right.
Morning.
Okay. What's your inbox like?
Depends what day you ask. But I will say that one of the very first emails we got, and at that point it was really just Alana Williams and I at AIBM, was from the Boston Foundation, was from Boston Indicators. This is our first partnership as an organization. It's also been our best partnership as an organization so far. But actually, just for us as a fledgling organization to be able to work with the team at Boston Indicators and Boston Foundation has really been a great learning experience for us. I'd like to kind of echo the compliments from Luke earlier that I think just for our team to sort of work with your team, we've learned a lot about how to make an effective partnership. And I think that the tone and spirit of it has been huge. So many emails, but not quite as many as welcome as the one we got from Boston Foundation.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Some of them are
imagine some
not
mixed
so
bag.
welcoming. Yeah, it's a very mixed bag. Yeah.
Well, you know, you mentioned that. You mentioned Boston Foundation, Boston Indicators. This is your first report where you partnered with an organization to look at a specific region.
Correct.
I'm curious to know, when you took this on, what was the very first thing that you were curious about? What did you want to know the most? What was your priority?
Because we know the national data pretty well through obviously our national work, what we don't know is how the particular issues facing boys and men are going to vary by place, and in particular how the intersection is going to vary by place.
Yeah.
And you take somewhere like Greater Boston, which, as DJ said in his presentation, actually does very well on average on lots of its educational outcomes. That's a very interesting place then to say, okay, well, let's look at gender, and then let's look at gender, as Luke suggested, through the lens of class and race as well, and see how that plays out here. That will be a very different story, for example, if we do work in somewhere like Baltimore, which doesn't have the same average educational outcomes. So I was very interested to see that. Because of some of the diversity you see in a place like Boston too, it's a good place also to test some of this, the intersection. The chart that DJ showed on gender gaps in higher education by race, I thought was really, really striking. When you see a 20-point gap between black men and black women compared to much smaller gaps for other groups, I think that shows you the value of looking at, in this case, you're looking at an educational outcome by race and gender in a particular place. And then you're saying, okay, here we have a real issue with this particular group of men on that particular outcome measure. And you can only do that if you localize the data collection.
Yeah, well, too, I'm interested in how much region plays in the outcomes of boys and men. Because like you said, you're very familiar with the national data. Now you've done this report focused on the greater Boston area. I wonder if you're getting any insights into how place plays into those outcomes.
I think it'd be fair to say that at this stage you can disaggregate some of the data that we've got at a national level, at the local level as we have here. And what you'll see is particularly in more rural states, you'll get different outcomes than in states that have more urban areas. And part of that is because of this intersection with race. And so we see in particular, like in rural areas, we're seeing quite different patterns and sharper patterns in some cases around some of these opioid addiction trends, notwithstanding the point that was made about racial changes there, suicide rates, et cetera. And there are actually some evidence that you see bigger gender gaps in college going from some rural areas than urban areas. But I think that's also going to hugely vary by state and by region. And so we're in the early stages of some partnerships now, I guess middle stages with Utah, a think tank in Utah, and we're commissioning some work with some people in Idaho. And so I think it'd be very interesting then as we get more of this to be able to compare, say, this report with reports from other cities and other states and start to say, okay, so if you're a policymaker in these states in particular, it's like, where do I need to spend my political capital and energy? Then that's inevitably going to vary if you are the mayor of Boston compared to, say, Baltimore, or the governor of Maryland compared to, say, the governor of Nebraska.
I want to jump to stakes. You know, the data that's been presented today, you know, just illustrates how urgent the issue is in addressing the issues of boys and men right now, these outcomes. And I feel like, you know, we're in a time right now where I think we're starting to see kind of the consequences of not having something for boys and men to address those things. You're seeing these gaps. You're also seeing some of this toxicity play out on the internet, where people have kind of stepped in to this void and positioned themselves as leaders, right? So now you have the manosphere and all these type of things. I would just love to hear you talk about what's at stake when leaders and stakeholders don't take this situation seriously.
Yeah, and I think this is a genuine difference of opinion that people have about this work, which is there is a view that, particularly in this moment, if you produce research like this, you point out some of these gaps facing boys and men, that somebody with a reactionary agenda is going to pick this up. And I guarantee, by the way, that somebody with a reactionary agenda is going to pick up this report and use it. I guarantee that. It's going to happen. Hopefully it's someone without much influence on the fringes online. But I guarantee it will happen. And your comm department will be like, you just need to know that this tweet or this Reddit thread or something used this report to say, you see, they don't care about boys and men. You know why? Because the woke feminists have taken everything over. They want to destroy masculinity, and that's why you should...
That zero-sum thinking.
Exactly. They'll play right into the zero. And this will be used by some people for that. And so that's the reason why some institutions have not done this. You don't produce this report because it could be used that way. Now, our view, I think I'll speak for the organization at this point, certainly my view, is that there's also another danger, which is if there are real problems facing boys and men, and they don't hear and see those problems being addressed by mainstream institutions, that leaves a gap, which allows the reactionary voices to say, this is a real thing, and they're not even talking about it. And I think that's a bigger danger. I actually think the creation of a vacuum by not talking about this in a straightforward, research-based, non-zero-sum way is a bigger fuel for the reactionaries than by talking about it. As I think Luke said, you seed the ground. Now, that's a calculation, and it's not without risk, and it's not without cost. Like, if you don't want anybody misusing your data, then never produce any data on anything, right? Which could ever be possibly used by someone for it. But that's just crazy, right? I think we need to go the opposite way and cut off the supply lines. I mean, Andrew Tate, who is in Florida, well, anyway, he says, boys and men are really struggling. The powers that be don't care about that. And when I try to talk about that, they come and silence me. That's what he says, repeatedly. Now, the trouble is, the first statement's true. A lot of boys and men are struggling, as we've just seen. Secondly, it's kind of true that they, as in the establishment, are not showing well enough that they care about it, right? Which makes his remaining claims plausible, even though they're batshit crazy, right? And so you seed the ground with points 1 and 2. So just take points 1 and 2 away from him. Be able to turn to them and say, what are you talking about? They don't care about boys and men. They're doing reports on it. They have task forces on it. And you've seen recently, maybe we'll get into this, a couple of governors making big statements on boys and men, which is not in your news feeds. The stuff about Andrew Tate might be in your news feeds, but the much more important development is serious people taking this seriously.
Yeah, you mentioned Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer. And,
two big ones. Wes Moore in Maryland and Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan both used their states of the state to make pretty strong declarations of intent around doing more for boys and men, especially young men in their states. They both also talked about this is not zero sum. We're proud of our record on helping women. That's obviously a very easy claim for Gretchen Whitmer to make, given her own efforts on that front. And that got some local press attention. I think that's interesting. We're obviously going to be hopefully working with those policymakers, but that's a much more positive and interesting development to me than some of this culture war stuff that we're currently seeing.
Well, to that point, I would love to hear you talk about how our community leaders and officials can better message to boys and men to cut through a lot of that noise.
Yeah, so I think this is a difficult one because sometimes you'll get people saying, well, and you were kind enough to mention that I'd been on Theo Von and so on, and I do think that leaders should go into those spaces, right? And don't cede that ground either. Contest it. Have that conversation. But I think in the end, the better antidote to unserious online men is serious flesh and blood men in real life and in real communities. And it's not going to get quite the same number of clicks. It's not going to be as exciting. And I get that. But I don't think we win by playing their game, right? The manosphere game around kind of clicks and outrage and so on. I think we win long run by doing good work on behalf of our boys and men and then showing that we've done it. And that's, again, it's just not as clickbaity. It's not as exciting. But I don't
keep it boring, right?
Keep it boring. Yeah, I mean, it's one of the mantras of our institute. Is and you've noticed how good we are at that.
Yeah.
DJ just gave the most thrilling presentation that anyone from AIBM has ever given, and he'll be getting some negative feedback from me as a result. It's like that was not boring enough. Actually, our mantra in the institute is keep it boring, and my son likes to point out that I'm the perfect person to do that. But But the serious thing is, like, another way is like, keep it serious, right? Do serious research with good intent that leads to real solutions. Then you can say to the reactionaries, you're talking about boys and men, but you're not doing anything about it. Look what they're doing in Boston. Look what they're doing in Michigan. Look what they're actually doing about it. And I think long run, that will really play. It takes away the argument that we don't care. We haven't even, in some cases, even acknowledged, let alone addressed. It takes that argument away from them, and then we just kind of do good work. And then to echo Luke's point about male teachers, and it's true that we've seen a 10 percentage point drop in the share of men in our classrooms in K-12. And I think that's particularly problematic in this kind of moment, because I do think that kids generally believe their eyes at least as much as their ears. And I think in many cases, the best antidote to a reactionary online figure is a real honest-to-God man standing in front of their classroom and out on the sports field with them, showing them, not telling them. And I think the absence of many of those male role models has created a different kind of vacuum where a lot of young men are desperately searching for answers of how to be in the world. And if they're not getting it from their teacher and their coach or their pastor or sometimes their father, if their father's incarcerated or distant, then of course they're going to look somewhere else. But that's kind of our fault that we've created such a vacuum for them that they do search online.
Well, that's interesting you say that, because you mentioned you have sons yourself, right? I wonder
3.
what do those day-to-day practices look like for somebody leaving this room today, holding those numbers in their minds. How do you show up and be that man in the real world, for that young man or boy who's looking for that guidance?
Yeah, I always find this a very difficult question to answer, partly because I'm from the UK, in case that's not obvious at this point. And so you're not looking at the face of modern American masculinity, let's be clear. I would never put myself out in that position. I think there's a couple of things. One is I just think just at an institutional and kind of policy level, I think as this report does, and as I think the important role that the Boston Foundation can play here is just broaden the permission space around this issue. It's just say it's okay to talk about this stuff, and we need to do some stuff about this stuff, and it's okay, right? I think just making it mainstream is very important. I think that there's this kind of fear, and you've heard it articulated in various ways today, quite rightly, but there's a fear that this will be misinterpreted, and we do quite rightly have to say it's not zero-sum. We're still doing work for women and girls, and we need to keep saying that. But at a certain point, we just want this stuff to become a bit more boring, a bit more mainstream, a bit like, well, of course you look at those numbers and would do stuff about that. Why? How can you look at those charts and not do something about that, right? It should just be straightforward. But in a more personal way, I do think that there has to be a call to men, which is a better call than the one they're getting from some other people right now. I do think that, and this makes me sound sometimes a bit more socially conservative than some people like, but I do think there's something about like young men especially needing to kind of feel needed, needing to feel called. The tribe needs you. We need you for this. And we do still need men. It takes a village, but some of them need to be men. And so I'm very struck by the fact that we don't have enough men volunteering, for example, or kind of in the school, not only as teachers, but as volunteers or as mentors, etc. You're seeing a lot of men actually kind of backing away from those sorts of roles. I think that's important. Big Brothers, Big Sisters, for example, in my area, I live in East Tennessee, they have their waiting list for boys is 3 times as long as for girls. It takes 9 months for a boy as for a girl, and the reason for that is because they don't have enough men who've signed up for it. So Big Brothers became Big Brothers, Big Sisters. Whatever you think about that decision, you should at least make sure you've got at least as many men. But I think that call specifically to men as men is not one that we've felt comfortable making in many spaces, and that's, again, created a bit of a gap, because other people can say, yeah, we need men to roll back all this feminist nonsense, right? Join our cause. There's always a bit of a contest, I think, for the allegiance of young men, and right now I think a lot of mainstream and more secular and more liberal institutions are losing that call to more reactionary ones.
Yeah, well, also I wonder, I guess the question that comes to mind for me, because even as you began to answer the question, you said, like, I'm not the image of modern masculinity.
I mean,
right?
people might disagree, but
yeah, that's what I mean.
but
What is it? Because I think some of these issues revolve around, I guess there's no set definition
Right.
for what manhood or masculinity is.
Nor should there be.
Yeah, so I would love to hear you talk more about that.
Yeah, I think it's partly why, and also, by the way, the term itself, masculinity, just doesn't play very well with a lot of young men. Right? It's a very social sciencey term. And then, of course, we make it plural, make it masculinities. And then they're like, what? And actually, to be honest, I mean, some recent focus group work from people like Movember, the men's health charity, suggesting that it's actually coding really progressive as well, that word. Because the modifier toxic has been added to it only over since 2016.
So you hear toxic masculinity.
Yeah, you hear masculinity
so
now. A lot of
often.
people, they're hearing because they're so often put together. But either way, just I don't think that these are great conversations to have on stages like this and on NPR and et cetera. But I think actually what's really needed is just work on making schools work better for boys and mental health services work better and helping fathers remain in touch with their kids, especially if they're in difficult circumstances, if they're incarcerated or et cetera. I think they're just doing that work in the end. I think that's where the work is, rather than these kind of endless discussions about masculinity. So I'm not...
What is this thing?
Yeah, and it's like, oh, well, I don't know, let's say Senator Josh Hawley, who was, by the way, among the first people to outright condemn Andrew Tate's return, to be clear, right? Most people were. So we should be careful. But Josh Hawley has a very, very traditional conservative definition of masculinity and manhood in his right. And I don't think it's sufficient. But I don't think the answer is to say, and here's mine.
Yeah.
Right? Here's how to be a man. I certainly didn't raise my 3 sons that way. And my three sons, all in their 20s now, they have very different versions, if you like, of quotes masculinity. Right? They're actually just George, Bryce, and Cameron in the end. And I have wanted them to be comfortable in their skin and so on. So I don't know how productive in the end a discussion is where we just have competing visions of masculinity. The only thing I will say is there's something about the idea of service and giving and quotes providing, but not in the economic post-war sense, but just actually historically mature masculinity has been separated from immature masculinity by a point in a young man's life where he's giving more than he's getting to the tribe or to the group. Right? And there's something about that, the idea of a surplus generator. Because, of course, women are generating surpluses in all kinds of ways too. But I think it's very important that kind of men feel like they are needed and adding value. So that's probably as far as I go. That sense of giving and a service-based masculinity is really, I think, a much more attractive one than a grievance-based one.
And I guess what I'm hearing too is where the work lies in is giving boys and men the tools for them to decide what their definition is for themselves, perhaps.
Exactly. I mean, I remember, we've had this interesting discussion within the Institute about how far do we engage in some of these cultural debates, right? And the answer has generally been not much at all. You can't avoid it if you're just out there talking about these things. But so one of our other mantras is never talk about the Barbie movie. Or more recently, don't weigh in on the man versus bear discussion.
Oh, okay.
For those who don't know that, there was a survey saying that most women said if they're out walking in the woods on their own, they'd rather run into a bear than into a man. And that was an inbox day where we had a lot of media inquiries saying, would the president of the American Institute for Boys and Men like to come on our show? Some of them were quite high viewer shows as well, to talk about the man versus bear controversy. No. But can we talk about the fact that in Michigan, only 60% of black boys graduate high school on time? Can we talk about the 40,000 men we're losing a year to suicide? Can we talk about the fact that the rise in drug poisoning, which was identified as an issue here, but nationally, the rise in drug poisoning since 2010, and this is the work that we've been doing at the Institute shows this, that rise alone is an additional 400,000 male deaths since the start of the century, which is about the number of men we lost in World War II. So the increase in drug poisoning deaths among men, separate from suicide, amounts to the equivalent of a world war in terms of loss of male life. Can I come on your show and talk about that instead? And the answer is usually no. But I think that's where the work is, honestly. It's like we have these real, actual, honest-to-God problems. And I want us to work on those, especially at a state level and local level, where a lot of the actual actors are who can do something about them.
Yeah. One thing I do find interesting about your work, the work you and your team are doing, is that you are including black men and that Latino men it seems because so often when we talk about these problems, right, like they do get filtered through like a white lens, right? And they get all the resources, and
Yes.
we don't include that intersectionality, and people get left out, right? I think we're seeing that with the opioid data.
Yes.
I would love to hear your thinking behind that, how your reasons for why that's important to you.
Yeah, well, honestly, a mixture, as with all these things, of kind of data and personal experience. To be clear, not my personal experience as an African-American man. In case it's not clear, that's like, I'm not. I've always been a white guy from the UK, although I'm a proud American citizen now. So personal experience, because my godson is black and from Baltimore, and just over time and him growing up and through the Baltimore City school system. And I should say actually that my middle son has just become a 5th grade teacher in Baltimore City.
Oh, wow.
It's a weird how the world does that, right? Yeah. I'm doing my bit. We did about another 500,000, I think. But seeing and I write, the chapter of my book is called Dwight's Glasses, and it was based on the experience where he came and he was wearing glasses a little bit like yours. And I said, why are you wearing those? You're getting old. I teased him about the fact he was getting old. I guess he was in his mid-30s at the time. So it's a bit early to have to be wearing those. He said, no, they're clear lenses. I don't need them. He sells cars for a living. And he said, I should say he's 6'5" as well, so he's a very tall black man from Baltimore. And he said, I just find that I sell more cars to white people when I wear these. He's less threatening. Turns out that's very well known among criminal defense lawyers, is to put glasses on black men when they're in front of a jury, because it sort of de-escalates around them. They see them as less threatening. And it turns out that when you're in white audiences and you tell people this, they go, really? And when you're in black audiences, everyone goes, yeah, duh. Like, where have you been, right? But that was just one example of me sort of learning very much from the outside about that. And the second part is the data. I mean, you saw some of the data just today, but I mean, if you're following the data and you don't come to the conclusion that black boys and men in the US specifically face very specific intersectional disadvantages, then I don't know what data you're looking at.
Yeah.
And the difficult thing, so that's why the chapter of the book and why it's a big theme for AIBM, because that's clearly where the data should lead you. The difficult thing is that I think that, I know there are a bunch of people in the room who do this work, so I'm interested in their reaction, is that even when you do work just for black men, that can become quite controversial. Like even President Obama had some difficulty with My Brother's Keeper around this. And I think My Brother's Keeper has not been able to retain its focus on black boys and men in a way that I would have wished it would have been able to. And I think part of that is it comes under pressure to expand.
I think we're seeing a very exaggerated version of that now with all the anti-DEI policies.
Right, people coming back. And again, because I think some of those DEI policies weren't driven enough by the data. If you're led by the data, then I think it's blindingly obvious you have to focus more on black boys and men in various ways. And also I'll say that I'm glad that we showed the chart this way. I think it's actually irresponsible to show certain outcomes, especially in education, by race without also breaking by gender. Because you just miss that gap that we just saw in these huge differences in outcomes for black girls and black women. And to be clear, that is not to say that black girls and black women we don't still need to do a huge amount more for them. But wow, as a general rule of thumb, you can take any gender gap in education and assume it will be at least twice that for black women and black men, which is what DJ just showed.
I feel like it's important to also touch on the transgender members of our community.
Yes.
And I think that's important because so often when we do talk about what men are going through, you inevitably come into the issue of the binary, the gender binary,
correct.
Right? And
yes.
So I wonder, how is AIBM thinking about the trans members of communities, and is there any research coming out from you to kind of enrich your efforts, right? Like how are we including transgender members of our community?
Yeah, well, I think it's a hugely important issue, and as this sounds like a cop-out, but it's certainly true and probably going to become more true, is that there is a genuine lack of data here, as Kelly mentioned. And when I was at Brookings, back at the Brookings Institution, we did some work on like which data sets are collecting data on trans and or non-binary, say, students in education, for example. So there is genuinely a dearth of data, and we should be doing a better job of incorporating that into data sets. It's not easy to do, by the way. Like I'm, conscious that Alana Williams, who's sitting in front of our managing director, was in government for a while and would very often have edicts, which is just measure this as well, measure this as well, measure this, add this group to yours. And the government, so it's hard to do. It's easy to say, but hard to do in practice. But I think the broader question here is, why are we even talking about men and boys, or women and girls? Aren't we just reinforcing this idea of the binary? The way that I think about that is that whilst it remains the case that there are obviously going to be some people who are trans, some people who transition, and some who are non-binary, of course, very different groups, that's still a very small proportion at this stage of the population. And so you can do two things at once, back in the spirit of this whole event, which is that you can simultaneously get information on and definitely honor and respect the rights and protect what are currently still the exceptions, but not have to abolish the whole rule. And a good counterexample of that would be like the gender pay gap, which we also just saw. I think it's still useful to measure the gap in pay between men and women. Now, will there come a point in the far distant future where that doesn't make sense? Perhaps. Should we also try and get the data on those who are not defined in one of those two categories? You bet. Should we have other lines on the charts? Yes, but I think we're a very long way from wanting to abandon, say, measuring the gender pay gap. I think that's really useful to know. Women earn this, men earn that. Very binary. Same in education the other way around. So I don't think we need to abandon the binary in order to honor the exceptions to that. Yeah. I think that's a trap that too many people have fallen into.
Yeah, but definitely not looking to abandon the binary,
right.
But wondering if by not including that data, are we missing something that could enrich?
Yes. And I think that again, the difficulty here is A, availability, and B, we have to recognize this. At the same time, you look at a very small group where you're going to see specific outcomes. But then you're going to see in absolute numbers, this is affecting a lot more men. So for example, some of the work that DJ's been doing, which you just saw a version of, on drug poisoning deaths among men by race. And we actually had an internal discussion, is you put AN men on there and you see very, very high, but it's a very small proportion. We looked at what it was in Boston, right? What was the share of AN men? Like 1%? Yeah, it was like 1% or something. Now, so that's in no way, in any way, to diminish the importance of that group, but you can look at a chart sometimes and see a relative share and actually not miss the fact that the line was just below that for black men. And black men account for, right. So
and
just in absolute numbers, it's just a lot more people.
Can you remind me, what's the AI?
American, Indian, Alaska Native, thank you.
Got it.
And so it's this, we're asking people to do a couple of things here. One is to say, never ignore any group, but also be aware that some of these groups are much bigger than other groups. And that's okay. Yeah. It's okay. You're not ignoring one group by saying that there are just, say, a lot more black men who are suffering from drug poisoning or whatever it is. And I think there's something similar here with some of the issues around non-binary. It's that you can honor that group, and it's very important, but you can't then say that's a reason to not care about other groups. And I think that's another version of the zero sum. And you see it on both sides. It's like you now see from the other side, it's like we need to get rid of all that stuff from the more reactionary view, right? We're not going to care about that because most people are men and women, so forget about all this woke nonsense over here. But to be a bit more provocative, perhaps in this room, sometimes it goes a bit the other way too, which is that in order to honor those minorities, then we can't talk about, say, men and women anymore. And I think that that's not helpful either.
Yeah. I have so many more questions for you, but I want to give the audience a chance to ask some questions. Does anyone have any questions?
Also, if there are questions specifically on the research, we're just going to bounce them to the research team.
Anybody? Yep. Hold on one second. This woman here with the yellow shirt.
Thank you. I'm Judith Baker, member of the Friends of Madison Park Technical Vocational High School, a very long-term teacher of boys in Boston. I would suggest that there's a missing piece to the research, and that is skills education for boys. When you take a child and you do not give that male child or child an opportunity to gain serious skills, you diminish him. When you give him the chance to become a plumber, he may not become a plumber in the end. He may become a business person. He may end up going to college, but the confidence of having a skill is enormous. That's why, and I was also a basketball coach, that's why our athletes do so much better than our non-athletes, because they have something to be proud of from a young age. Boston has failed to offer high-quality technical vocational education. I'm not talking about training, because the skills that we're offering are skills, real skills. These are not your 20th century vocational programs. They're mostly white students attending tech folk high schools in Massachusetts. Our students are denied those opportunities. And I can tell you that the boys I have taught, which is thousands, if they have a real skill at age 13, 14, and 15, they're so far ahead of where they would be if they didn't have that skill. So only, just one thing, so only to measure academic performance and college completion is to completely negate half of our kids who could have high skills. Thank you.
How do you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, this could be it is a whole conversation in itself, and I refer people to a webinar we did with MDRC on what is it about technical and vocational training that seems to kind of particularly help boys and young men. And MDRC are actually planning to do more work on that, but that is the evidence. And so a failure to invest in skills, CTE, competency-based education is just bad, period, but it turns out to be particularly bad for boys and young men. And so again, I think it's a great example of it's not zero sum, but doing more. I was intrigued by the comment about race and it being more white boys white students going to technical schools. I think that's an area to dig into. I'd love us to learn more about that. I think right now, the last 2 or 3 years of high school for a lot of boys are very difficult and don't add much value. I think they're bored. They're not engaged, and it just seems to be a little bit harder for those boys and young men to stay on track and stay engaged when they've lost any sense of competency or skill development on average. For good girls are a bit better at that.
Yeah, just curious, what makes you say that, that those last 3 years are kind of useless?
Yeah, so this is an area we really want to do more work in around student engagement. We know that boys don't like school as much as girls, especially as you get into those high school years, according to the OECD reports, the PISA reports, and so on. That's true internationally, by the way, not just in the US. But the College Board have recently been doing some focus groups, and this is not public yet, so I can only sort of briefly summarize it, but they're just seeing some of the engagement gap really growing, particularly those last 2 or 3 years of high school, especially from kind of lower income areas. And I think that obviously there's a very difficult history around tracking in the US and about saying, oh, wow, you're never going to go to college, so why don't you just do shop class, right? And that has had very classist and racist implications. I think the fear of that, which is understandable, has now led us to back away from those investments generally. And that's it's not like the current public school system is doing an amazing job with those boys or girls that we're really worried about. And so I think it's time I think we're having a better conversation now about CTE, and we're adding our voice to that as to how far it affects boys.
CTE?
Career and technical education.
Gotcha. Thank you for that. Anybody have a question? Anybody else? I see a hand over here, the gentleman in the back.
Good morning. Y'all can hear me okay? Awesome. My name is Alex Bonanno. I use the he, series pronouns. I work in the Office of Racial Equity and Community Engagement for the Boston Public Health Commission. It's very lengthy, so thank you for listening to that. But I just wanted to ask a question around, well, one, just to highlight some of our work, and then to ask a question around two areas. So recently at the Boston Public Health Commission, we released our Health of Boston reports, which we release annually, and so we have released our reports around life expectancy. And then recently, we also just released our Live Long and Well Health Equity Agenda to address life expectancy disparities in the city of Boston. So especially, I don't know if you all have seen that, but we saw that one of the major differences between residents that live in Roxbury and Back Bay, that there's a 23-year life expectancy difference. So those living in Back Bay and in Roxbury are experiencing those difference in life expectancy outcomes. And so again, that health equity agenda came out in July, this past July, in order to address those outcomes. But in thinking about just my positionality within the Office of Racial Equity and Community Engagement, and just understanding, the need from just what was presented today, and the need for more local health departments to do more for our young men, and not just young men, but young men and adults in the city of Boston. Just thinking about that community engagement piece, especially in this era of, you mentioned like Andrew Tate, and just all the skepticism, the mistrust, the distrust in local government or in government in general, rightfully so, because of, abuses that have happened for our people of color in the city of Boston, and in particular, in the U.S. in general. But just thinking about that community engagement piece, what would you say for folks, not even just for local health departments, but for other folks that are here representing other organizations to actually do this work, to engage? You mentioned the need for mentorship. What does that look like? What supports do you think you all would be able to provide for folks who are trying to engage engage in these populations in an equitable manner at that, so that we are, having folks be partners and not just research subjects?
I love the way you ended that, by the way. Partners, not subjects. And I think that, let me start at one level up, which is one of the things that can predict ill health is social isolation, as you all know from your own work. And so actually finding spaces and places within which we can ensure kind of social connection is hugely important for everybody. But there's at least some evidence, and this is forthcoming work from AIBM, that DJ's leading on, is around the isolation seems to be a bit greater for men, especially young men. And so I think that although you wouldn't say it's a health intervention to reduce the decline in the share of young men playing sport or attending, community groups, or even things like scouts, or whatever it is, mentoring, big brothers, big sisters, I've already mentioned. So I think like tackling that isolation issue, and you see it particularly among, at least on the national data and some city level data that Camille Bousset at Brookings has done in Charlotte and other places, where it's particularly, again, black men who are very often at highest risk of isolation. So that's an upstream thing. And then in terms of like community health, I'm a huge fan of community health centers. And I think that whatever we think about the reasons why, they're likely to play an even bigger role in the next few years. But it comes back to this question about representation. I think particularly in areas like mental health, the fact that we have so significantly reduced the share of men in those professions is important and not acknowledged enough. And our own work suggests that the share of social workers who are men has gone from 40% to 20%. The share of psychologists at men has gone from 60% to just above 20%. They're both falling. And so, and in schools and in community centers, it's very hard to find men, especially hard to find men of color, but honestly, just men who are in those professions. And to the extent that might make it a little bit harder for young men especially, or for men generally. Like I think if an area gets coded as male or female, rightly or wrongly, fairly or unfairly, it just gets harder to get people who are not of that gender identity to go to that place. And I really am afraid that a lot of the issues around mental health, increasingly sort of to a lot of young men, that codes as a bit female, because they only see women providing that care. And I think that's unfortunate. I think representation really matters, is what I'm saying. And I think that particularly in those healthcare professions, the declining share of men is as big a problem as the inadequate share of women in other professions. And we have quite rightly invested a huge amount of time and energy to get more women in law, in medicine, but also in the STEM professions. I am all here for that. But we have seen no equivalent efforts to even arrest the decline in the share of men in education, healthcare, especially mental health care. So let's start there.
So Alex, that answers your question? Okay. I saw somebody over here.
Thank you. First of all, this was an amazing way to start the morning. My name is Satvik Alwalia. I'll be a dad in May, so excited to hear about how to become a first good boy. I have a daughter already who's great. I'm also the chair of the state's Asian American and Pacific Islander Commission, and I started a group called Dad Buds to create play groups for dads. As a member of the commission, I realized we don't have one for men and boys, and I've been working on legislation to create one. But I was wondering, from your perspective, looking at a national level, what is the best kind of interventions you have seen to address? Is it like an office at a executive level or a commission, or what have you seen?
Well, we've seen lots of different approaches, is the honest answer. There has been a continued attempt to get a commission on boys and men created in Washington state, which has failed repeatedly, and I think in large part because politically it was seen as coming from a pretty conservative place. There is now work going on more on the Democrat side of the aisle in Washington state that is not necessarily around creating a commission, but it could be a working group. And in the end, I think the question is, what is the best way to draw the right kind of attention to these issues and to give policymakers at all levels the tools and information they need, including permission, and permission's hugely important, and data, and some ideas about solutions and some learning from other states. And in some cases, that might well be something like a commission. But in other places, you get much more from a good research report or a governance convening, etc. And I think I've been a little bit guilty of sometimes thinking you need to institutionalize this thing, right? And I do think we need some more institutions around these issues. But at a local level, I think it's a second order question for me. And you can sometimes think that the creation of a commission, at worst, the creation of a commission is sometimes a way for politicians to tick the box without actually doing anything. And even worse can be a task force. When I was in the British government, we created a task force on something, and one of the civil servants explained to me, the reason we're doing that is because everybody knows that task forces undertake very few tasks and have absolutely no force. And so I think there is something quite dangerous sometimes about that. That said, I do think that having someone waking up every day thinking about this, like the Office on Black Men or whatever it is, and I think that like a lot of the women's organizations have done a really good job of just kind of making sure that if there's new data, that it's cut the right way and draw attention to it. So I think somebody has to be waking up every day thinking about this issue, whether that's best done through a commission or an institution or part of a university or part of the mayor's office. I don't know, and I don't care, because it's going to vary very much by local context.
It's John Mayer.
Hi there. Thank you for this morning. I run a small grassroots nonprofit around mentorship and basketball in Cambridge, and received a lot of requests around girls-only nights and creating girls-only workouts, and have never received a request for a boys-only workout. And coming out of this morning wondering if there's research either that you've been a part of or otherwise about the power for adolescent boys of having boys-only spaces, and if that's a direction that you would recommend kind of small nonprofits go, or if it's something that perhaps is more meaningful for girls. Thank you.
Yeah, so if the question is a direct question, which is, can I point to good research on the benefits of boy-only, girl-only space in adolescence? The honest answer is no. And I find sometimes, to my own frustration and to questioners' frustrations, is that the honest answer to a lot of these questions is, I don't know. We need to do more research. And the trouble is that's such a cop-out, particularly for scholars, is more research required is like the ultimate cliche. But I think in this case, it's actually true. And one of the things that I'm proud of that our institute is doing is to be able to get funds to commission research to try and answer some of these questions, which kind of feel intuitive, but we don't have good empirical evidence to support them. And so what I would encourage you to do, I will say that I have argued in favor of some all-girl and all-boy spaces, particularly in adolescence. Right? So I'm saying that we don't have great empirical research, but I've argued in favor of at least then trying them and seeing. My intuition, and I'm being very careful about how I say this now, is that there's real value to some spaces like that. Because I think it can create an environment within which actually, like, weirdly, not that boys become more boyish, because that's kind of, to some extent, that they're going to be like that. But actually they kind of learn the other side. And for girls, perhaps, I mean, you look at things like Girl Scouts. Unfortunately, Boy Scouts doesn't exist anymore. It's co-ed and called Scouting for America, but that's a whole different rant for another day. But I do think one of the things that the Girl Scouts or YMCA groups and so on will kind of pride themselves on is they'll kind of get girls or young women together and really kind of work on issues around like assertiveness and training and professionalism and STEM and all of that, which might be harder to do in a co-ed environment where those things tend to code male. I think the same is true the other way around too. I think in all male environments, you can actually create cultures where you are developing nurturing skills, love, etc., in a way that's probably easier when there aren't girls around. Because again, those code a bit female. As I said, I don't have great research for that, but what I'd love you to do is try it and see. I will say that just on principle to say that we're in favor of all girls' spaces or all women's spaces and against all boys and all male spaces is a mistake. Like, I do think we should be consistent about this and then see what works. And I get why there's been a concern about all male spaces in professional life, but I don't think that applies to your, and thank you for your work, by the way. I don't think that applies to mentorship schemes in basketball in Boston. We're worried quite rightly about the old boys club in many areas, and we're quite right about that, but that's not what you're doing. And I think people have falsely read across from their suspicion of all male spaces, say in companies or professional life, into things like youth groups, and I think that's been a mistake.
Let me hear question.
Hi, my name's Brianne Bowen. I'm actually with the Women's Foundation of Boston. Richard, there's actually substantial evidence that shows that in academic spaces, all girls' education is stronger for girls, and boys actually benefit from co-ed spaces. So you have to wonder, sort of, what are we asking our girls to do in those spaces? My question is actually more for the Boston Foundation. I'm curious, when looking at some of this data, how you intend to use this research to move your mission of racial equity forward. I'm thinking in particular to the chart that talked about academic outcomes and college graduation. If we're looking at the 20-point spread between Black men and white men, we should also be looking at that 15-point spread between Black women and their white peers. So I'm curious how the Boston Foundation intends to operationalize some of this work in terms of advancing your mission of racial equity forward.
So I'll have a go at the first, and I'd love to be updated on this, and then maybe someone from the Boston Foundation can answer the second. So I looked very hard at the evidence on single-sex education, because a lot of people were saying it was good for boys. And I got to tell you, having looked very, very hard at it, especially the more recent evidence, I don't see good evidence for benefits for boys or girls from single-sex. Yeah, because the stuff I saw on this was really old. And therefore I thought outdated, but the meta-analysis that I summarized in my book didn't suggest strong benefits in either direction, and so that's why I didn't come out very strongly in favor of single-sex education for either. And I do think there's a problem here sometimes, is that something that was true 30 years ago is not necessarily true today, and sometimes it's very hard to update. I found it difficult myself to update my priors for more recent evidence, so I'm happy to engage offline about that. But the second question was thankfully aimed more at the foundation.
I'll just respond briefly. You know, folks hopefully know this, but Boston Indicators is of the Boston Foundation. We are here, but I can't speak to the programmatic work that the foundation does. I'll say one of the really neat things about the origin story of this project is it part of the inspiration for us was learning from the work that initiatives incubated at the Boston Foundation, like Success Boston, have done for many years. You know, and Success Boston is this really effective initiative that continues in a new form now, that's very directly embedding student success coaches in public higher education, you know, very directly trying to address some of what's on your mind. But I'm sure the folks here who've led that work over the years would be happy to talk more.
Right here in the black jacket.
How you doing, Lawrence Kimbrough, he, him pronouns. So I have a couple of policy ideas, and maybe they might be controversial, but I actually don't think there's much controversy behind them. You know, if we want to take care of men's mental health, let's get rid of DraftKings, FanDuel, like in the state, right? We know that in those states where we have online gambling on sports, like you're going to find higher suicide rates. You're going to have more issues with men's financial struggles and challenges, which are already there. Right, we can stop advertising like sex ed products to like men and boys at like younger ages, right? I mean, we certainly see now that there are economic concerns with boys and men right now. Like, do we need to be advertising products around sex to like young boys to sort of make them feel like there aren't enough already, and that like taking a pill somehow like makes them more of a man? I don't actually think we have an issue like with trying to get more men into the field of education. It just doesn't pay very well, right? So why don't we just pay like people who work in public education more money? And I think we would see that some of this data will look a little bit better. Thank you.
What do you say to that?
Well, we've just published a summary on some of the evidence around gaming, especially online gaming, and the negative economic impacts, especially for low-income men. So I'd refer people to that. I think it's very, very early research field, to be fair. I think we kind of need to learn more, but it is an area that we are digging into, and we're in the early stages of partnership with another organization who are interested in online issues, particularly around young men online, including all the issues you've just raised. I think at this stage, the idea that we're going to be able to dramatically roll back some of the changes we've seen recently or curb some of the access, I think it's hard right now politically in terms of policy. I think our role is just to get better research done so we can understand the risks, who it is affecting, what the costs of it are, et cetera, and that might then prepare the ground for a better informed debate about what are the policy implications. On the male teachers thing and pay, completely agree. I mean, one of the difficult things about this is that, like if you're a female teacher and I come along and say, we should pay teachers more to get more men, they quite rightly would say, well, how about just paying us more? And I think that's a pretty reasonable reaction. The story here is gendered, though, because for a very long time, we got much better teachers than we were paying for because women didn't have many career opportunities other than teaching. And so, like, yesterday's teacher is today's lawyer, right? And so we got good teachers on the cheap for a very, very long time. That era is largely over. And so if we want good teachers of either gender, we're going to have to pay them better, right? And I think it's taking policymakers a hell of a long time to realize that this is a dramatic shift in the relationship between pay and the teaching profession. I do think it would help with male recruitment as well. As pretty, we know that men are very sensitive to pay, particularly on entry to profession, so I think it would have that additional benefit. But I think it's important to argue for higher teacher pay in and of itself. And I think it would have that other consequence. The other thing, though, is like if you switch into teaching, it's very hard to even kind of get recognition for the years you've done outside of teaching. So, and actually men are more likely than women to choose teaching as a second career. And so to the extent that it's harder to go into teaching and that you get financially penalized for doing so, that's another barrier that disproportionately affects men. And so there are various, and one of the things we really want to work on in various ways is like, what are the specific barriers to men entering teaching and what can we do about those? Pay is one of them, for sure, and there's a bunch of others.
That's all the time we have. I'm very sorry. You'll be around for questions.
For sure.
Feel free to bother Richard after.
Thanks, Daryl. Great job, by the way. Thank you to Daryl.
Thank you. On behalf of Boston Indicators and the Boston Foundation, thank you all for coming out. I guess stick around and hang out for a little bit.
Yeah, awesome.